From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, everybody. I'm Steve Scrovan in Los Angeles. David Feldman is in New York City, and the man of the hour, Ralph Nader, is in Washington, D.C. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, David. Good morning, Steve.
Ralph, this week the spending bill is before the House, the Senate, and possibly our president. And at the last minute, they put in some corporate goodies. Are they good or bad for America?
Well, this is what happens in the last few days of the congressional session. I was down on the Hill, or what's known as Wuthering Heights, Capitol Hill, yesterday. And it's quite an interesting visual. There were limousines around the various office buildings of the Senate and the House. There were huddles of men in three-piece suits, both in the corridors and outside the buildings. I didn't see many citizen advocates scurrying around the halls. Of course, they're tremendously outnumbered. And what's this all about? Well, it's all about a monster bill called the omnibus bill, which is a procrastination innovation by the Congress for not dealing with the parts of it in a procedurally traditional way with significant hearings, etc. So they're trying to keep the government open. So they got all these different budget appropriations, but it's a happy time for corporate lobbyists because they can stick in a paragraph here and a paragraph there and do a lot of damage before anybody knows about it. Or if somebody like Elizabeth Warren knows about it, it's really too late. So they've already stuck in a doubling of what a couple can give to a candidate or political campaigns from a little over $1 million to $3 million. They've already stuck in something that allows the Wall Street barons to speculate more freely on the derivative situation. That was denounced by Senator Warren yesterday or earlier in the week. They've already done damage to pensions, and that incurred the ire of Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan when she took to the floor in a very poignant presentation about the workers who are about to be done in. What does all this say? What it says is that whenever there's going to be the last days of a congressional session, all citizen group hands should be on deck. They should not have vacation time. They should not be junketing to Europe for some international conference. They've got to be on the spot, on the Hill, in the corridors, in the Senate, and the House offices. Because enormous damage can be done in the hundreds and hundreds of pages of this bill in abstruse legal language that it sometimes takes reporters months to figure out. A tax loophole here, a waiver there. It's a global indictment of the congressional process, and we've got to make that a big issue in coming years.
How dirty is this bill compared to previous spending bills?
We don't fully know yet. In fact, the full printout, adjusted periodically by the hour, was just put in the hands of the Democratic Party a few days before adjournment. So we don't know. That's the whole bit. This is crass lobbying at its worst because everybody knows it comes with a quid pro quo. The proper job after leaving the Congress, the money for the campaigns, you name it. It's very corrupt, and it's so corrupt that it's become institutionalized. Instead of being a absolute outrage inviting 100,000 people surrounding Capitol Hill from all parts of the country, it's just business as usual.
I remember this time about 5 years ago, after we bailed out the banks, they started giving themselves $1 billion in bonuses. It was just such a slap in the face. And we learned about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that it was the credit default swaps that tanked the economy. And now the bankers have the audacity to write into this bill a measure that would allow their credit default swaps to be insured by the federal government. I mean, that is just... What could be worse?
The reason? Too big to fail. They know that any one of these giant banks heading for the cliff is going to be bailed out by you, the taxpayer. That's why Rena Steinzor, who's going to be our guest next week, professor of law in Maryland, has written this new book called Why Not Jail? focusing criminal prosecution not so much on the corporation as on the corporate bosses who often escape and laugh all the way to the bank. Often they escaped entirely in the Wall Street crash on the backs of 8 million workers, trillions of dollars of worker pension money and mutual funds. So that's the story. And the lesson here is we've got to get ready for these end of the session orgies where government is for sale, legislation is for sale, in a quid pro quo of campaign cash corruption. Go
and
ahead.
It's with the threat of a government shutdown if it's not passed.
Yeah, that's how they throw people up against the wall. Either this or a government shutdown. But it isn't either this or a government shutdown. They could do another continuing resolution for 5-6 months, put it off until next year again. At least they won't be able to slam the public up against the wall of a congressional session adjournment. But you know, more and more people, Steve and David, are hitting the streets. And although I've been skeptical of the stamina of demonstrations ever since Occupy Wall Street, I'm seeing something different here. I am seeing organized marches and demonstrations. I'm seeing repeated ones. They're now in their 8th day or so in New York City protesting the Garner homicide and the refusal of the grand jury under a guiding prosecutor not to indict the culpable officers. But I'm seeing it all over the country. For example, this last week, medical students from 72 medical schools have marched in the streets with the motto, "I can't breathe," reflecting Mr. Garner's last words before he was choked to death in New York City, for not opposing, not confronting. He was just selling unlicensed single cigarettes. So I think what's happening around the country with the immigration demonstrations, the student loan demonstrations are starting. In California, they're beginning to demonstrate against tuition hikes, and the demonstrations against police homicides and the lack of grand jury reforms to put special prosecutors in whenever a civilian unarmed is killed by a policeman, because the police go to work every day with the very police who give them the arrest records, investigate for them. It's very much a close working relationship. They're not about to ask a grand jury to indict. By the way, in 2010, federal prosecutors moved for 160,000 indictments, and they got all but 11. So if the prosecutors really want to indict a police officer, they could, but they don't want to. So that's why you have to replace the prosecutor on a particular case with a special prosecutor and engage in other grand jury reforms. You remember, it was this top judge in New York who said once, a grand jury can indict a ham sandwich. It's secretive, very one-sided. The defendant cannot represent himself or herself. No lawyer, no defendant, all one-sided. So people are demonstrating for reform here, for suitable sanctions on police who go overboard with excessive use of force. Now, you put all these together and you add the protests and demonstrations on the XL pipeline and other demonstrations on environmental matters, and then you add the work stoppages and the demonstrations for minimum wage in front of McDonald's and Burger King and Walmart. I think you're seeing something coming together here. I'm the last person to be overly optimistic about street protest stamina and turning into action, turning into reality, changes, reforms, legislation. I think you put all these together, they're going to be constantly nourished by abuses. And what's happening is more and more young people are learning the skills of direct action, of nonviolent civil disobedience. And that's very, very important. So in a way, I think what's going on is going to be much more lasting than Occupy Wall Street.
I'm really surprised to hear you talk this way because you mentioned it last week, and there's a big demonstration this Saturday nationwide about the Garner verdict. I was marching last week. Well, I was walking home, and they were going my way, so I joined them for a couple of blocks. And
they swept you up in your fervor. Is that
yes.
right, Dave?
So I thought, okay, Ralph says, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm always wary of these protests. These were my concerns. What are we allowed to do in terms of civil disobedience? Because there were some things I saw, like they surrounded a cop car, and the cop car was stuck for about 20 minutes. And I thought, well, you know, the cops would be well within their rights to start making arrests because they are making it possible for the police to do their jobs. I mean, what level of civil disobedience do you find tolerable?
Well, that's the whole point. The key is the following, Dave. Open, nonviolent civil disobedience by people willing to incur the law enforcement that will be directed to them. So, blocking roads, surrounding a police car, they're basically saying, for the greater good, to challenge the cruelty of existing law, like racist laws in the South years ago, we are willing to be arrested. And we will come back and we'll make the same point again and again. So the key is open, meaning public, nonviolent civil disobedience. Long tradition in America, often the only way to change unjust laws or unjust enforcement practices.
And in a refreshing development, there have been some major sports figures, particularly NBA stars Derrick Rose, LeBron James, Kyrie Irving, in relation to the police brutality demonstrations, wearing T-shirts saying, "I can't breathe," and showing some leadership we haven't seen in the sports community for a long, long time.
That's right. LeBron James is one of them. And it's quite a contrast because when LeBron James entered the National Basketball Association as a 19-year-old, we wrote his agent as saying he signed up for LeBron James shoes, and they're going to be made by serfs in Indonesia and later Vietnam. Lucky if they make $1 a day, horrible working conditions. And we'd like LeBron James to come out for more decent and safe working practices in the factories that are going to produce his trademark shoes. No answer. 2 years later, wrote again, no answer, becomes a big star, and now he's got "I can't breathe" on his practice shirt. So maybe he will extend that to the workers in those dungeon factories making those shoes where they can't often breathe.
Ralph, my iPhone was made in a dungeon factory, and I was using it to videotape the shield numbers of the cops. And the New York City cops said I could videotape them. I just can't put the camera in their face. Across the country, are we all allowed to use our cell phones to videotape the police? Or is that on a city-by-city, state-by-state?
I think it's a First Amendment right. And unless you're doing it in a way that obstructs the police or traffic, that is, you step at a distance, if they try to stop you, that's an unlawful act.
Well, I think that's a good opening salvo for the show. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, we're going to talk to our special guest today, Mr. David Halperin. Come back after this.
Stand up. Oh, step up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Stand up. Oh, step up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan along with David Feldman and Ralph. And our guest this hour is someone I've got to know over the past few years. We were brought onto the Board of Public Citizen at the same time about 6 or 7 years ago. He is a Washington, D.C.-based lawyer, writer, and advocate, the founding director of Campus Progress, and senior vice president at the Center for American Progress. He was a senior policy advisor for Howard Dean's presidential campaign, founding executive director of the American Constitution Society. He was also a White House speechwriter and special assistant for national security affairs to President Clinton, co-founder of the internet company Real Networks, and counsel to the Senate Intelligence Committee. Today, he's the leading advocate fighting against the abuses of for-profit colleges. His ebook on that topic is called Stealing America's Future: How For-Profit Colleges Scam Taxpayers and Ruin Students' Lives. Sounds like a great stocking stuffer. Ralph, please welcome David Halperin.
Thanks
Welcome
for having
to
me
you.
on the show.
Welcome to you, David. Let's first lay the groundwork in terms of the pattern of abuses for these private commercial universities before we get into what is being done about them or what is not being done about them.
Okay.
David, why don't you explain why you are so exercised about this problem, enough to write an ebook about it and to spend a lot of time trying to marshal the forces of reform against these gigantic commercial educational enterprises?
Yes, I spend a couple days a week now on this issue, both writing about it and exposing abuses, and also working as an advocate trying to get change in Washington. And the reason this issue is so important to me is because we are ruining the lives of a generation of people, especially low-income people, people of color. $30 billion a year of our tax money has been going to this industry. And what this industry does is use deceptive and high pressure tactics to get people to sign up for their schools. And they refer to the students not as students, but as pieces of business and asses in classes. The goal is to sign up as many students as you can. More than half of the students who go to these for-profit colleges, which purport to teach things like information technology, automotive, nursing, healthcare careers, more than half the students who sign up drop out within a year. The prices are astronomical. It can cost 10 to 20 times as much as a similar program at a community college. These students sign up, the taxpayer pays for some of it, the students take on both government loans and private high interest loans. And then again, many of them drop out and they're left much worse off from when they started. So A, we're wasting taxpayer money. B, we're not helping these students when we really could be spending the money on ways to help them train for careers. And C, we are ruining their lives because we're leaving them with debt that they really could never afford to pay back, even if they got the jobs that were promised to them by these programs, and often they do not get the job.
David, why don't they go to the community college instead if it's so much cheaper and the community colleges have a good reputation and they're not profit? Why do they go to Phoenix University or the Kaplan schools or others that you've named in your book?
Because the community colleges have had their funding cut by both Republican and Democratic state governments, and they're in the business of turning students away. The for-profit colleges spend a good chunk of the money that we give them on marketing, advertising on daytime TV, ads on buses, ubiquitous ads. The biggest advertiser with Google is the University of Phoenix. And they're constantly trying to tell you why your life will change if you sign up. If you do anything, if you enter into a website, your phone number, they will call you 20 times in a single day and pressure you and tell you how your life is worthless until you come to their school. So they're doing so much more to try to sign people up. Michael Brown, the young man who was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, people said he was headed to college and he had a promising future. He'd actually signed up for Vatterott College, a for-profit school that's been exposed as a fraud through criminal prosecutions of its executives and lawsuits where the jury has issued multi-million-dollar awards. By the way, one of their investors is a man named Mitt Romney, who has praised and invested in this for-profit college industry. For-profit college industry's smiling faces are people like Mitt Romney and lobbyists in Washington like Trent Lott and Don Graham, the former owner of the Washington Post company. Those are the people who are out there saying it's a wonderful thing to Congress and in Washington. But the people pressuring the students are expert boiler room operators and getting them to sign up.
Let me ask you, why are community colleges turning students away? They don't have space for them?
They don't have the space because they don't have the money. It's also true that we haven't done nearly enough and done it well enough to train people at the high schools, through apprenticeships, and through state colleges, community colleges, and other state schools towards careers. There's too much focus on teaching them Shakespeare and not enough on teaching them to be plumbers and nurses' assistants.
How many students are involved here? Give a quantitative estimate of how many students go to these commercial colleges or universities, and name a dozen of them because people will connect them more in terms of what you say.
Yes. Corinthian College is the one which has failed, although it may be too big to fail. It's something we can discuss. It may be treated as too big to fail. Runs Everest University, Wyotech University. EDMC, the second biggest for-profit college company, runs Brown Mackie College, the Art Institutes. University of Phoenix or Apollo Company runs the University of Phoenix. Kaplan runs the Kaplan schools. Career Education Corporation is another big player in the space. Those are some of the ones with the worst records, and ITT Tech. All of those are under investigation by a range of federal and state agencies for fraud. These for-profit colleges have 13% now of all U.S. college students, but they get 25% of the federal student aid now, and they account for 47% of all the student loan defaults. So if you go to the school, you're something like 4 times as likely or 5 times as likely to end up defaulting as if you went to a nonprofit college or a public college.
How many students are enrolled in any given year in these schools?
It's something like 4 million.
And most of them never finish the first year? Is that what you're saying?
More than half drop out within an average of about 4 months.
Now, what is the Department of Education doing about this in Washington? They're supposed to be regulating it. What's happening in Congress? Do these commercial schools have powerful lobbyists? Is the new reform law worth anything? Why don't you explain that?
Well, the Department of Education was asleep and let the growth of this happen in the 90s. The Clinton administration tried to do a little bit. In the Bush years, they let it go, not blindly. They openly let this orgy of waste, fraud, and abuse occur with our tax dollars. And of course, many of the people who worked for Bush, either before or after the Bush administration, went to work at these very same for-profit colleges. And basically, they've allowed the money to go in with really no accountability standards. The standards that are there are easily gamed by the schools, so that they even programs with horrible results in terms of job placement and debt for students don't get caught in it. So the Obama administration has tried to crack down by creating a rule called the Gainful Employment Rule that would say basically if a high percentage of your students are unable to pay back their loans after they leave your school, then maybe you shouldn't be getting federal aid anymore if you consistently perform badly in that way. The industry went insane lobbying, have spent millions and millions of dollars and hired people like Trent Lott, John Breaux, President Obama's own communications director, Anita Dunn, and many, many more people to lobby in Washington, to pressure, to do public relations campaigns to try to stop any kind of accountability. And they've succeeded in getting the rule gutted. Then they went to court and got a judge to throw it out completely. The administration then redid the entire rulemaking, and in light of all the evidence of abuses that have come out in the course of this struggle, actually produced a somewhat tougher rule, which the industry has immediately gone to court to try to strike down again. The rule is not tough enough, but I will tell you this. In the course of all of this fighting about the rule, we've built a coalition of 50 consumer, civil rights, veterans, student organizations, and the media has investigated, and we've helped the media investigate. And this industry has been exposed as one of the worst scams in the history of this country. And the students they go for, of course, the least efficacious people out there. But even they have started to get the message that maybe they shouldn't be going to these kind of schools. Enrollment is down. They're all important. Share prices are down. And some of these schools are on the verge of collapse now as they've been investigated and exposed as a fraud.
And what is the website people can go to if they want to join this reform movement?
Well, there's two things. Please go read my articles at republicreport.org. I also post them on Huffington Post. But Republic Report is where I've got a lot of articles about the corruption in this industry. You should also look at protectstudentsandtaxpayers.org. That is our coalition website, and it will tell you what organizations from labor to civil rights are involved in this and what we've been trying to do.
David, is there any private litigation, consumer class actions, and is there any activity of the students who have been pushed out for a variety of reasons? They were misled, they were deceived, and they end up with a lot of debt. Any organization there as well?
There's some, Ralph. There are some class action suits, and there are also some of the whistleblower type lawsuits that the government has actually joined the ones against Corinthian and EDMC. As you can imagine, this industry would be among the leaders in forcing students to sign mandatory arbitration clauses, take it or leave it contracts, so that they can't go to court. They have to go to arbitration, which tends to favor the institution. But these institutions are so bad that even arbitrators are starting to rule against them.
Have you thought of drafting a model contract protecting the students that they can go to these schools and say, this is a contract I want you to sign if you want me to sign up as a student?
They're not going to have the power. What we have done is gone to the Department of Education in the last year and said, you're giving them this money. You can demand as a price of participation in these programs that you do not have a mandatory arbitration clause. But the department hasn't gone for that. And right now, Corinthian College, really one of the very worst companies in this business, is about to fail. And the Department of Education seems determined to sell them to a company called ECMC, which has been in the business of being a particularly aggressive debt collector for student loans, has no experience running any kind of educational institution. And they are insisting that they be entitled to have a mandatory arbitration provision in their contract with students, even though they say they're going to run the colleges now as a nonprofit. Nonprofit schools, to their credit, have not had these mandatory arbitration clauses. So we're saying if you really want to show that you're different and you want to help these students, don't do it. But we're not getting any support from ECMC or the Department of Education, at least not yet, on this. So it's bad news for students. Education is moving in the direction of becoming just another corporation that mistreats the people who come in contact with it.
David, there are three rebuttals to your case. So I'm going to put them to you, 1, 2, 3, quickly. These colleges, for profit, says that they're the only ones who accept and train a lot of low-income youngsters. Shouldn't the students be able to decide for themselves where to go to school?
Well, that is what the industry says through all kinds of smarmy homilies and statements about this. They say we should be, I've heard the head of the trade association, a former congressman named Steve Gunderson say we should be congratulated for educating these students. Well, I would congratulate them. I'd be the first to congratulate them for educating these students. And some of the institutions actually do a decent job, but most of the big ones that dominate his trade association don't educate students. They simply take their money, and there's no congratulations at all due. There's condemnation due for that kind of thing. The low-income students that they take, so many of them end up worse off. What they ought to be doing is forcing the bad operators out of business and working to create a system of honest colleges, whether they're for-profit or non-profit, that will be held accountable and that will educate those students.
Well, the other thing these commercial colleges say, there's a double standard. They're supposed to be held to a percentage of their student graduates getting jobs, known as gainful employment rule, but this doesn't apply to nonprofit colleges or universities like Ohio State or Arizona State or Oberlin.
Well, that's another lie that they tell, because in fact, the gainful employment rule applies to all career education programs, whether they're at a for-profit or a nonprofit. Now, it does apply to pretty much everything at the for-profit college programs. That's A, because Congress put that into law, and so that's the only authority the department has, and B, because the proof is there. These schools, the big ones and many of the small ones, have a record of fraud. There's a school in Florida with the wonderful name of Fast Train University that was in the news last week for something that I actually discovered 2.5 years ago. They were sending strippers in cars and scantily clad women to try to recruit men to come sign up for the school. A lot of the men for criminal justice programs wouldn't have been eligible for the jobs anyway because they had criminal records. And the other thing that they did, and now they're the subject of an indictment of their CEO as well as a federal and state lawsuit, is they would sign up a lot of people who hadn't even graduated from high school, which is not legal to get federal aid for those students. They're supposed to get a high school degree first. They'd tell the students, don't worry, we're going to get you a high school degree as you go forward, when in fact all they did was make up fake high school degrees and then present them to the feds as evidence. That's the kind of scam that is going on here.
You think you're going to win?
Well, it's a long struggle, and we've made a lot of progress. Mitt Romney, when they asked him in 2012 what he would do about higher education, said, oh, I think for-profit colleges is the way to go. Didn't disclose that he was heavily invested financially in them, both as donors and as his business partners. In the last election, you didn't see that. A lot more politicians said they would go after for-profit colleges. None of them said that we love for-profit colleges. So the tide is turning. But Jeb Bush spoke this year at the For-Profit Colleges Trade Association meeting as the keynote speaker, and he said the gainful employment rule was a threat to higher education. So if the Republicans take over the White House, you could see this swing back. They certainly own a lot of the Republicans in Congress, or almost all of them, and they own a number of Democrats too. So we have to keep fighting. We have to keep working to disclose this, to let people know, to make sure that students know what they're getting into, and to make sure that good programs, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, are the ones that get our federal money and not these scam operators who sometimes are living in a strip mall, but who quite often are living on Wall Street or in big corporate suites, the people running these things, and who should be ashamed of themselves.
David, give the website once more so our listeners can connect.
Everything you want to know about the scams in this industry are at republicreport.org, or in my book, which you can buy on Amazon, called Stealing America's Future. And my name again, David Halperin, Halperin. And if you want to get involved in activism on this, protectstudentsandtaxpayers.org.
And our newly minted protester, David Feldman, has a question.
Thank you, Ralph. Do we have evidence of lobbyists going out of their way to destroy community colleges in order to make private colleges more attractive?
I don't have that evidence. I do have evidence that they've engaged in false lies and character assassination of people who have tried to stand up for students. And the other thing they've done consistently is co-opt nonprofit organizations and media by giving them money. The Chronicle of Higher Education, which should be the unbiased chronicler of this industry, they've paid them to have events sponsored by for-profit colleges where they let the for-profit colleges choose all the speakers. Americans for Democratic Action, a venerable liberal organization, apparently cash-strapped, has spoken out in favor of this industry, and I'd be willing to say it was for money, and they can come prove me wrong. The Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington crew, which has done some good work on exposing corruption in Washington, attacked critics of for-profit colleges. I always said it was because they took money, and that finally was exposed. They took money from the founder of the University of Phoenix, John Sperling, to do this. So there's a huge amount of corruption involved in the tactics of this industry.
Well, this is very good, David. Let's turn now to another area of your expertise and experience in government, the Senate Committee on Intelligence's torture report, which has been page one for several days now. That was a 550-page report that was read in advance and redacted very often by the CIA and other intelligence officials in the White House. And it's based on 6,000 pages that the committee staff compiled that are still secret. And what we've seen here is a remarkable, towering breach of the separation of powers, where it's been disclosed in past months that the CIA and other agencies actually snooped on members of Congress, the NSA, and the CIA got into the computers of the Senate intelligence staff offices and requested that the Justice Department file a criminal action against some of the Senate Intelligence Committee staff. I mean, I've never heard of this. In all the years in Washington, I've never heard of this brazen attempt to suppress the towering in return duty of the Congress to monitor the executive branch and make sure it obeys the laws and adheres to the Constitution. What was your reaction to the report?
Well, I work for that committee staff, and I do find it shocking. There has been, since 9/11 or a little bit before that, a trend away from taking this congressional oversight seriously. Now, of course, as you know, prior to the 70s, there was no serious congressional oversight. But the terrible revelations of what our intelligence agencies were doing in our name, destroying other countries' democracies, violating human rights, led to creation of these oversight committees. They started to build up some power, some credibility, some expectation that they would be told the truth. And they have to be told the truth because the public isn't told all these things. They are the only thing, the only proxy for any public check on these intelligence agencies, which always left to themselves have the potential to run amok. So if the congressional oversight committees are treated like somebody to lie to, and then even, as you say, aggressively to try to turn into criminals themselves, then there's nothing standing between us and completely unaccountable government.
It's worse than that, of course. It's no-fault criminal government because torture is a criminal violation of federal law, the Army Training Manual, the FBI rules, and international law.
And it's barbaric. And imagine Americans participating in those kinds of things. We have become what we beheld. We've been reduced to the level of savages.
And it isn't effective. You agree with the Senate committee's conclusion that has incurred the ire of the CIA and its bolsters among the Republican Party in the Wall Street Journal say, what do you mean it's not effective? It's caught terrorists planning attacks on the U.S. It's saved thousands of lives. But the Senate committee report is extremely specific in saying that it is not only cruel, brutal, un-American, criminal violation, but it's not effective.
On balance, it's not effective because people will say anything when they're being tortured. Now, it may be that there are some times that we could learn something through torture that we couldn't otherwise learn. It's possible. It is possible, but it's not worth it. It's not because there's the possibility that it might produce results doesn't mean we undermine our entire system. Look at the one senator who has been tortured. He's just about the only Republican who's on the side here of saying it's appropriate to release this report and it was inappropriate to engage in torture. That was, of course, John McCain.
That's right. It's interesting. It took an experience over the years in jail in Hanoi for one Republican to reflect it and come out the right way. But the other Republicans, most of them draft dodgers who love wars but don't want themselves or their children to fight them. They're willing to send low-income whites, blacks, and Hispanics to fight them. They are in high dudgeon. How dare Senator Feinstein do this? How dare the Senate committee do this? It's going to put our soldiers in trouble overseas. Of course, one of the arguments against torture is if we engage in it, it's going to be wide open to be used against our soldiers in incarceration. And of course, it may not require that to have our soldiers be tortured. They may be tortured anyway. Right. But the torturers can say, look, you Americans do it. What are you saying that we can't do it?
Right. ISIL waterboarded the Foley, James Foley.
Well, I do take seriously that our country was attacked, that people want to hurt us. I've worked in the White House on national security issues. So I'm not somebody who's just going to say, you know, this is all just a myth. There are no threats to our country. The question is, How do you go about this? Do you go about this in a way that shreds our Constitution, that shreds our values, that destroys the separation of powers? Or do you go about it with confidence and intelligence? I think that some of this is just blind fury of the people involved, that they're angry that we were attacked, and so they engaged in these things, or they were making money. These two psychologists or psychiatrists, whoever they were, got $82 million over just a few years to run this thing. I mean, I worked for George Tenet. He was the staff director of our committee when I worked there, and I had a lot of respect for him at the time in all kinds of ways. But what has happened here is barbaric and atrocious, and we all ought to figure out ways to keep it from happening again, because it easily could.
Well, this is being, as we say, on the Republican side, it's being decried as a partisan report. It's not receiving, except for John McCain, any sort of bipartisan outrage here. Does that mean that anything's going to come of it?
It is hard to make reforms. I do think something has come of it in the sense that I don't think we're still torturing people. We're committing some, I would say, questionable acts in the people that we're still holding in the war on terror. But I think the pendulum could easily swing back the other way, especially when you have these Republicans basically standing up for torture and saying it's basically the American way, and that if you criticize it, then you don't support our troops and you don't support our country. I mean, the idea that at this point in human history, you would have people so unapologetically praising torture as the way to go just suggests how far we have to go in this country to educate people and to mobilize people to stand up for justice and human rights.
You know, torture is the second most important motivation to expand the number of people in those countries who hate us and want to fight us and want to provide cover for those who fight us. The first leading motivator is the invasion itself of the United States, such as in Iraq. So what we're doing basically is boomeranging ourselves with criminal invasions and torture. Not only doesn't work in a specific case, because as David said, with few exceptions, the person will tell the torturer anything, including false statements. But on a larger scale, it's motivating more and more hatred against us.
The president calls it torture, and Ben Emerson, he's the rapporteur on human rights and counterterrorism for the UN, said that the U.S. is legally obliged to bring those responsible to justice. Is there any hope that the UN or the international courts could prosecute these guys, since we won't?
Well, all Cheney has to tell the grand jury is that the torturer was moving toward him in a threatening way, and I think that the grand jury is going to let him off.
You don't see any chance of prosecution, nor do I, by the Obama administration, Bush, Cheney, and others who were right up to their neck in authorizing it, knowing about it, not to mention those who actually executed the torture. But what do you think of Anthony Romero's op-ed in the New York Times a few days ago, David? He's the head of the American Civil Liberties Association, who basically said they've been trying to get prosecution of these war criminals by the Justice Department for years. It's not going to happen. Therefore, President Obama should pardon George W. Bush and Cheney and make a very important historic point in doing it. What do you think of that?
I thought it was a provocative and kind of a profound thing to say. And it does kind of make sense. And we're not going to prosecute these people, even though we've been to some extent contributing to the creation of international courts of justice to provide accountability for people in other countries, heads of state even, who have committed all kinds of atrocities. But we're just not going to see ourselves that way. We're not going to allow it to happen, just as we always negotiate when we're overseas, that our troops won't be held accountable for abuses in other countries. I mean, the kind of things that our troops have done in Iraq and other places, the idea that we'd allow foreign troops of other countries to, go to New Jersey and start spraying people with automatic weapons in traffic circles and things like that. We have the view that we're simply not going to be held accountable, and I think that will go on.
These were contractors who were doing the torturing, not
some.
And where are they now?
They're continuing to contract for, if not for the government, for other people. They're experts in interrogation and psychology and other things.
And they're giving interviews this week attacking the Senate intelligence report, saying it's false. I mean, these guys are brazen. They have no shame. They've pocketed all kinds of taxpayer money, and they've demonstrated that the U.S. government is willing to contract out torture.
If people are willing to allow guys in Gitmo to be tortured, why wouldn't I mean, obviously the next step is torturing American citizens. This is sadism.
It's certainly the argument that it works, you could just as easily apply to our own people. Someone's been kidnapped. We need to find her. Let's torture the suspect so he'll tell where she is so that we can save her. Same logic.
That's a very good point. David, you've been terrific. We're out of time now. Give that website once more, and we'll have to move on to other subjects.
Come to republicreport.org, and you can learn about how Washington is being corrupted by for-profit colleges, oil companies, banks, and other interests.
Thank you very much, David Halperin.
Thank you all.
We'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll take some of your listener questions. Back with the Ralph Nader Radio Hour after this.
Stand up. Oh, step up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph Nader. That was a great segment with David Halperin. Ralph, you wanted to spring something on us, I understand.
Yes, this is completely unrehearsed, listeners. They don't even know what I'm going to do to them.
I'm a little worried.
But you'll resonate with this because it has a real lesson to it. Okay, here we go.
Oh, God.
Steve Scrovan and David Feldman.
Yes, sir.
Let's make it fast-paced.
All right.
Steve,
yes,
who
sir.
are you? Who are you?
My name is Steve Scrovan. I am a middle-aged white male who lives in Los Angeles, California, originally from Cleveland, Ohio.
Who else are you?
I am a father of two. I'm a husband, the son of the late Clarence and Tony Scrovan. What else?
Who else are you?
I am started as a stand-up comedian. I was a comedy writer. Did a documentary about a guy named Ralph Nader, who we called the Unreasonable Man. And what else do you need to know about me?
Well, I'm going to give you a little timeout and go to David, and then I'll come back to you. David, who are you? Who are you?
David Feldman. I'm a comedy writer and a frustrated journalist.
Who else are you?
A frustrated human being who's disappointed with the country at large.
Who else are you? Come down to earth.
I'm a father, a husband, and a victim.
Who else are you? Who else are you?
I think he's copying off of me because I said the father.
I know.
I'm trying to see how distinctive both of you are. Who else are you?
A frightened, aging comedy writer who's trying to pay his bills and lash out at society.
It means you're a consumer?
No, I'm not a consumer. I pride myself on rarely buying things.
Okay, who else are you?
A guy who reads a lot. And
what would you call that?
A pretentious effete.
I'm looking, in the interest of time, I'm looking for one-word answers.
Okay.
Like if you're a carrot eater, I want you to say I'm a carrot eater.
I'm a vegetarian.
Okay, who else are you?
A Democrat.
Who else are you?
Borderline socialist.
Now we're swinging. Who else are you?
I believe in God.
Who else are you?
I believe in capitalism.
Okay, let's give you a timeout. Switch back to Steve. Who else are you, Steve?
I'm also vegetarian.
Yes, who else?
Atheist.
Who else are you?
Athlete.
You want to break that down?
Are we allowed to lie like that?
No, I am an athlete. I'm still an athlete. I was a college football player.
Okay.
And I still play in a fast pitch softball league every Saturday, just trying to fight off age.
Okay. Who else are you? We're getting in the groove now.
All right.
One word answers, if you can.
I'm a brunette.
Okay. Who else?
I still have my hair.
Yes.
I am artificial hip.
That's what you are. Who are you?
Oh, who am I?
Yeah.
I am. Oh boy. Now I'm running out of stuff that I am. I'm an uncle.
Okay.
Of two. Yeah. I'm an uncle. I'm a. Wow. This is.
I think I know where he's going.
Okay. I'm switching to you in a minute, David. Let's get one-word answers.
Yeah, I think I know what you're. Okay.
Go ahead. Who else are you?
I am a Italian/Czechoslovakian heritage.
Okay.
I am I already said it was a comedian. I am. I've run out of what I am.
Okay, let's switch to David. David, who else are you? One-word answers.
American, and it took us a long time to say that, right?
Okay, that's good. Keep going. Who else are you?
A citizen.
Bingo!
Oh, boy.
A voter.
Bingo!
I think you won, David. You won. I lost.
You won, David. You realize when I do this with students, they'll go like 30, 50. They'll say, I'm an eater, I'm a music lover, I'm a whittler, I'm a cat aficionado, I'm a traveler, I'm a tree climber, and almost never do they hit the word citizen or voter.
Yeah, until listening to Steve struggling for it, it occurred to me that we never said we were American citizens.
You're going to receive a bunch of bananas for coming up with that right answer. But, this is really better than playing trivia when you have parties. It's better than a trivia game because it really gets into people's identity. How do they see themselves? And you have a lot of apathy in the country. It's not surprising. Half the people don't vote. They don't show up. It's not surprising that even after 30 names describing who they are in their own words, they don't get to voter or citizen. Congratulations, David Feldman.
Thank you. And 30 years ago, what would have happened? How quickly would somebody have come up with American citizen?
Don't know. I just started this about a year and a half ago. But it should spread. Our listeners should do it themselves, try it on their neighbors and their friends, and then report back to us what happened.
That's a very good idea, yeah.
It's the who are you game. Imagination, identity.
And the right answer, or the answer we're trying to get to is citizen. Yeah. And whoever gets to it quicker wins a bunch of bananas like David. I'm kind of upset that David has beaten me probably in the only thing possible he could beat me at.
But what you don't know, Steve, is David will give you one of those bananas.
And it'll be bruised, I'm sure.
All right. Who are you? Let's spread it through the land, folks. It's a lot of fun, but it's very, very serious.
Let's take some listener questions.
Let's segue right into there. Ralph, this is from Mr. James S., and this is actually, I think, quite good. He says, James S. asks, would you like to see the Electoral College eliminated? If not, why?
I would like to see it eliminated because it's an antiquated piece of American history designed to help the small states many, many decades ago, and it's now become a laughingstock for the world. We are the only country with elections where someone can come in second in the popular vote and become president or prime minister. And so Al Gore won the popular vote in 2000 by over 500,000 votes nationwide, and he lost because it was thrown into Florida, where the shenanigans started, by the state Secretary of State, Governor Jeb Bush, all the way to the 5-4 political decision of the Supreme Court. And if we didn't have the Electoral College, the man who got the most votes, Al Gore, would have been president. There is a movement underway, recognizing that the electoral vote basically has sabotaged the popular vote in at least 3 or maybe 4 presidential elections in our history. That's not de minimis. There is a movement underway that's going to succeed in getting rid of the Electoral College without having to amend the Constitution. It's called an interstate compact, and it started in Maryland. And Maryland passed a law that says anytime a presidential candidate wins the popular vote, we will assign all our electoral votes to the winning candidate who won the popular vote. Now, California has enacted a similar law. New York has enacted the law. Illinois, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. There are 11 states who have passed these laws to abolish the Electoral College by interstate compact, and they total 165 electoral votes. Once enough states total 270 electoral votes, it's bye-bye to the Electoral College in reality, and from then on, the winner of the popular vote nationwide wins the election. So you don't have to zero in on 1 or 2 swing Electoral College states like Ohio and Florida and ignore so much of the rest of the country. This was started by a handful of people led by Steve Silberstein, who lives in the Bay Area in California. And he just told me on the telephone that he is confident that within 2 years, this is going to reach 270 votes, especially if we can break some of the big states, maybe like Texas or Florida, through the legislature. But I think it's pretty exciting. And it's not just that the winner of the popular vote will win the election. It's that it affects the whole strategy of the campaign before Election Day as to which states to ignore and which states to put your money in instead of running a national presidential campaign, which, by the way, is what we did in all my presidential campaigns. I went to all 50 states to campaign.
Is it possible that by 2016 this will be in effect?
Possible, probably a 1 out of 3 chance, but by 2020, it should be a certainty.
Wow, you've heard it here first. Electoral College out by 2020. Now, I've heard some things about there's also a movement afoot to sort of gerrymander the Electoral College. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, the first reform is to have it done by congressional districts. So there are a couple states that now say that if a congressional district wins a majority vote for John Smith instead of Mary Chapin, they will assign that percentage of electoral votes of the state to the winner of the popular vote in the congressional district. But that's not going to go very far. It's a step in the right direction. We need to go the whole way.
Okay. Ken Steele asks, what do you think of the Green Party's platform, and why do you think they lack the kind of cohesion in America that they seem to have in Europe?
I think the platform is wonderful. I think, for the most part, the Green Party positions on labor, on consumer protection, on electoral reform, on taxes, on corporate accountability, on trade, on war, I think they are supported by a majority of the American people. Why it doesn't get traction is twofold. One is it's the winner-take-all rule in America. So if you don't win the election, you get nothing. So you can get 49% of the votes, you end up with nothing. Not so in a lot of European countries. For example, why is the Green Party so more influential in Germany than it is in the U.S.? Because under German law, if they break the 5% of the popular vote, they get over 5% of the members of parliament. If they get 10% of the vote, they get 10% of the members of parliament. If they get 4% of the vote, they get nothing. So they get over 5%, they get a chance to grow. They got a voice in the parliament, and they get a chance to propose their agenda and to campaign. And the next election, they get a chance to get even more. There are no second chances in a winner-take-all for third parties in this country. Because in addition to being knocked out by this rule, and they have to start all over again, they are excluded from the debates for the most part. They are excluded from campaign finance because they don't meet the qualifications in most states. They are excluded from the ballot without a superhuman effort on some states to get hundreds of thousands of signatures to get on the ballot. And therefore, they're excluded from the media because they're viewed as not having a chance. And therefore, they're excluded from the polls. We have a two-party tyranny. It's a two-party dictatorship. It doesn't tolerate competition. It rigs state and federal laws to make sure that happens. And we cannot call ourselves a democracy by any modest standard while this condition continues to happen, depriving millions of voters of voices and choices.
Well, very good. We've come to the end of another Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We've learned a lot today. I think the main thing we've learned, David, is that Ralph has really missed his calling as a game show host. But join us again next week for another exciting adventure, and maybe we'll have some more games. Who knows?
David, Steve thinks he's kidding. I want to be a game show host. Anyway, thank you all. Steve, David, your listeners, on to next week.
Goodbye, everybody.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
From Pacifica, you've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Special thanks to John Richard, Matthew Marin.
Our graphic designer is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our editor is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our board operator is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
Oh, what the hell? Let's make him our producer.
Our producer is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
And thanks to our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
And most importantly, special thanks to Mr. Ralph Nader, www.nader.org.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, is written and performed by Kemp Harris.
If you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast and would like to listen to it as a broadcast,
call your local radio station and say, I want the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
He's Steve Scrovan.
I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman.
Until next time.
Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice? Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you. Listen to me, people. Do you understand? We gotta stand up. Oh, you've been sitting way too long. Oh, step up. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, you should. Oh, step up. Step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up. Rise up and take on the power. Stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, stand up. Oh, step up. Step up. You ought to step up. Rise up. Rise up. I know you ought to rise up and stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. I think you step up. Step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, stand up. Oh, step up. Step up. I think you should step up. Rise up. And you rise up because you have the power. Stand up. Hey, stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Stand up. You step up. Step up. I think that we all should rise up. And you rise up. And you rise up. Stand up. And you rise up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up. Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up.